Beginning this week, Pastor Cyndi is doing a series of sermons on Sundays about saints, people who either were sainted by the church or people whose impact on the church as we know it today was great enough to warrant considering them as saints. And today we're going to talk about Saint Iranaeus, and I will give you some historical background and in this video, and then Pastor Cyndi will talk about the stuff that I'm incompetent to talk about, specifically the theological impact of Iranaeus in her sermon on Sunday. When looking at the history of the development of the Christian faith over the millennia, seems clear that one of the most persistent traits in the development of Christianity is conflict. This is true certainly of the early church, but it remains an unfortunate fact of life for us in the church today. We have disagreements between denominations, but we also have disagreements within denominations. Couple of examples, the question of whether or not women should be ordained for the pulpit or for leadership in the church. Some churches are willing for that to happen. Others think that there is no way that women should be part of the ordained process. We have today, and we see this within the United Methodist Church, an argument over what the role should be of gays and lesbians within the church, whether they should be allowed or should not be allowed the same kind of rights and powers that others have. There's a disagreement within or between churches over the communion table. Who should be allowed at the communion table? Some people would argue that only members of a specific denomination should take the communion in their denomination. Others have an open table where they invite anyone who is willing to come to be allowed to participate in communion. And there are even some denominations that don't recognize baptisms that take place out of their denomination. And so it means that if you join that particular church, you have to be rebaptized. And unfortunately, in our day and age, most of these are argued out in media, either social media, or on television or in newspapers. When Marty and I lived in Nashville, I guess maybe because that's the home base of Lifeway, the Southern Baptist organization, and also the Methodist Publishing House. Every time there seemed to be an upheaval in either of these denominations, it would be on the front page of the Tennessean. And it would remain there sometimes for several weeks. And I always wondered what people who were non-Christians thought about this debate within religious denominations that they were able to read about and probably didn't understand. But controversies of this type are not limited to the 21st century. In fact, some of the most dramatic conflicts occurred in the immediate aftermath of Pentecost, when the young church was just beginning to take hold. Recently, in several different groups in the church, we have studied Mr. Skinner's book on the Acts of the Apostles, and the Acts of the Apostles outlines a number of these. Most of our people have studied the epistles at one time or another, and the epistles address a number of other issues within the church. Obviously, the perhaps the most critical in some respects controversy, excuse me, certainly one of the the best known was the question of whether or not Christianity was more than just a spin-off from Judaism. Did you have to be a Jew in order to be a Christian? Or more to the point, did you have to follow all of the Jewish laws if you wanted to be a Christian? But even beyond that, there were questions, disagreements, heresies is the term we use today. One of them was about the nature of Christ himself. Was Christ truly human, or did he only seem to be human? And then there's a disagreement over whether or not Christ actually died on the cross, or whether he only seemed to die on the cross. There was even a group of people who argued that the God of the New Testament is so completely different from the God of the Old Testament that Christians needn't pay any attention at all to what was in the Old Testament. Now, most of these were settled over time, and these things, as I say, became known as heresies. Now, I'm not theologically smart enough, and I admit it, to understand these, and I'm certainly not smart enough to try to explain them to somebody else. That's why we got Pastor Cyndi dealing with this on Successor Sundays. But I do want to make a statement of historical caution. Always remember, history is written by winners and not by losers. Now, what that means for me as a high school history teacher is that I don't often ask my children to deal with questions about what would have happened if. I would much rather them understand what happened and understand both why those things happened and what the implications of them happening was. All of that is to me much more important than what might have happened. But every now and then, it's fun to try to consider what might have happened if certain things had been different. For example, at the beginning of the French and Indian War, George Washington desperately wanted a commission in the British Army. He believed that the British Army was the finest fighting force on the face of the earth. And he had given them great support as a militia captain of the Virginia militia, and he believed he was deserving of a commission. The British chose not to give him one. Well, now you can't help but wonder, had he gotten that commission when the revolution broke out, would he have been fighting against the Americans rather than being the force that held the American army together during the American Revolution? Another issue, most colonial Americans, most British North American colonists believed they had two enemies. One were the Native Americans, the other were the French. They felt like they could handle the Native Americans, but they were constantly concerned about the French. And so when the French and Indian War ended, England had the choice of taking from the French either Canada or the Sugar Islands that the French had in the Caribbean. Common sense would say you take the Sugar Islands, because sugar was the most valuable export that any European nation could get. But for a variety of reasons, the British chose to take Canada, gave the Sugar Islands back to the French, and consequently, they removed from the equation the only enemy that American colonists didn't feel like they could handle without British support. All we had left was the Native Americans, and we were confident we could take care of them. So when England begins to lay taxes on the American colonies to pay part of our defense, the Americans were angry and responded in ways that we all know from the origins of the American Revolution. But you got to wonder, if the French had still been here, would we have objected quite as vigorously to British taxation policies as we did? And then, of course, if you're a good Southerner, then you got to sit back and say, what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War? If indeed we had broken off from the Union? How would American history have been different if any of those what would have happened if had happened? So what about these so-called heresies? What about the things that rocked the early church? They were a part of the debate. All you got to do is read what Paul says or what Luke says in the Acts of the Apostles about all of these issues. But what would have happened if some of those heresies had won out rather than being the losers? What books in the Bible might not be in the Bible if certain things that the early church eventually discarded had become the norm rather than the exception? What would have been the impact of Paul? Probably nothing that Christians do today depends more on any one person other than Jesus Christ than depends on Paul. Would Paul have been the dominant figure that Paul becomes if this not had happened? What would Christianity have been like if what goes down in history as heretical had actually been the norm? And what goes down in Christianity as the norm, the true faith, had been weighed in as heretical? How would Christianity today be different? Now, I realize you think I've gone all the way around Robin Hood's barn to get to a point, but this is where Iranaeus becomes important because he is one of those people who battled most consistently against the things that we would call today heretical. He was born sometime between 120 and 140 AD. He was born in Smyrna, it was in Asia Minor. It is today, it's got a different name, but it's part of the nation of Turkey. Smyrna was the hometown of a man named Polycarp. Not that he's also a saint, but that's not one of the ones we're going to focus on. But Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna. And as what makes him significant is he was supposedly a disciple of John the Disciple. Now, if that's the case, he is, as far as we know, one of the last remaining people with direct contact with those disciples that Christ called. And in fact, there is a rumor, whether it's true or not, nobody knows anymore, that John the Disciple is the one who appointed Polycarp as the bishop of Smyrna. So Iranaeus would have been raised in a community where one of the last remaining people who was on a first name basis with Jesus's disciples was a man of some significance. And again, unlike a lot of early Christians who were raised either as Jews or were raised as Gentiles and became Christian after the impact of the Holy Spirit, Iranaeus was raised in a Christian household. And so having been raised in a Christian household in a community where this gentleman who was a throwback, if you like, to Christ's time itself, there's no doubt they came into contact, and no doubt there was some impact on Iranaeus's life from that. Now, in the early Christian era, there were on again, off again bad times at the hands of the Romans. The truth is, the Romans early on, and from the time of Alexander, who I think his first date is something like 17 BC, until the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, that's what's called the the Roman peace, the 2 centuries of peace. Rome is so dominant. They drive the pirates off the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean becomes a Roman lake, if you like. You can move from place to place without any kind of fear. They also drive the highwaymen off the roads, and so travel within the Roman Empire is easily done. The Roman Empire includes the northern part of Africa. It includes much of the modern day Middle East. It includes chunks of what today would be Central Europe. And of course, it includes almost all of Western Europe, including the British Isles, up to the line of Hadrian's Wall. We don't pay much attention to it, but there was regular trade between Rome and China. It was kind of hard to imagine, but that's how secure the Roman world was. But the Romans were always concerned, particularly the Roman leaders were always concerned, that they be a status not too different from the status of that pantheon of gods that the Romans believed in. And because neither the Jews nor the Christians would give the Roman emperors that kind of respect, they were from time to time subjected to some fairly intense persecution, particularly in the first century of the Roman peace. Of course, we know that Nero probably burned down major parts of Rome so he could rebuild it in a form that he felt represented his greatness. And rather than take the blame for that himself, he blamed it on the Jews and the Christians and brought them all in for some kind of persecution. We know that Peter and we think Paul both died at the hands of Nero and his persecution. But Nero's not alone. In Vespasian, one of the ones who comes after Nero, he utilized persecution. In fact, he sent his son Titus to destroy Jerusalem. And if you look at the Arch of Titus, there are scenes of them carrying all of the wealth out of the temple before they destroyed the temple. But by the end of the first century, with the arrival of the Emperor Trajan, the Romans, I guess maybe because they were so secure in who they were and in their power, they changed their way of dealing with the Christians. After Trajan, he dictated that Christians as a group would not be persecuted. You could still persecute individuals for what they did, but not Christians just because they were Christians. And so Irenaeus's year, if he's born, let's pick the date 130, halfway between the 120 and 420 that we have. If he's born in 130, he's born in the aftermath of Trajan's change in policy. The church starts to become what the church of the medieval ages was. They developed a hierarchy. They developed the Bishop of Rome, then became the Pope. They began to develop congregations that met first in basilicas. In many cases, they took over basilicas that were designed to support individual Roman gods. They also began to construct cathedrals of their own. And the church, because there is less persecution, the churches get out of the catacombs. They get out of the home churches, although home churches still exist. But there is a stability during a great part of Irenaeus's life. Now, again, under Marcus Aurelius, there's more persecution than there had been earlier. But again, by then, the church was established enough. Now, it won't be for another 150 years until Constantine that it will become the religion of the Roman world, but it becomes a religion of the Roman world. Now, at the same time that the church is beginning to get its wheels under it, we also have a great transition in the Roman Empire. The average Roman, the little guy, if you like, the peasant who owned land and worked the land, and peasants who lived in the city of Rome itself, or in outlying areas like Ostia, they found themselves economically and psychologically stressed. Part of the reason was that Roman senators, the most important people other than the Pope in the Roman world, were not allowed to engage in commerce. They couldn't own ships, they couldn't run caravans, they couldn't buy and sell things, they couldn't manufacture things. That was considered beneath them. And so you've got one of the wealthiest groups in all of the Roman world who got to find something to do with their money. And what they started to do was to buy up the land of the small farmers and began to put together large estates, latifundia, they were called. Now, the problem with that, of course, number one, is that the small farmer was the heart and soul of the Roman army. Rome, like Greece, like others in the ancient world, didn't trust their military to mercenaries or to conscripts or to slaves. They believed that if you put somebody in your army who had something to lose, he would fight a lot harder than somebody for whom it wasn't nearly as big a deal. In the American Revolution, of course, you know, the British hired 3,000 German Hessians, and it was true then as it was in the ancient world. The Hessians were good soldiers. They fought well, but they weren't going to give up their lives for Britain. And if they got in a bad spot, they'd wave the white flag, and that would be fine. And so the Romans knew this, and they needed these small farmers. Well, when there are no more small farmers, there wasn't a lot the Romans could do. They began to use mercenaries. They began to take barbarians. One of the things the Romans did, if they won major military victories, the land that they took, they divided up into farms, and they settled the soldiers from the army that won on that land. And so all of these peripheral areas of the Roman Empire had ex-Roman soldiers that were farmers in the area who could be called back into service at any point in time. But now suddenly the people who had been the small farmers had two choices. They could stay on the land and work the land for the senators as peasants, and many did. And you can see in this the beginnings of the so-called Dark Ages, where you've got the manorial system with a few people owning a lot of land and the mass of the people working that land as peasants for somebody else. That doesn't just happen in the medieval ages. That begins in the late Roman Empire, the latifundia, and then the serfs were known as coloni. The other thing they could do, of course, is they could come to Rome, looking for jobs, looking for money. Now, the truth is, there weren't very many jobs in Rome. The life of the average Roman citizen was not very good. There weren't jobs. They wasn't enough food. They were unemployed. And so what happens in the late Roman Empire is that the series of emperors, and with Marcus Aurelius's death, he'd been followed by his son Commodus. And Commodus was what I can only call a wastrel. I doubt that any of my students at St. George's Episcopal School would have any clue what the term wastrel meant. But you know, he was kind of one of these eat, drink, and be merry, and who cares what comes after we go. And what did come after when he died was a civil war to determine who the next emperor would be. And that sets the tone for the late Roman Empire, as a general wins on the frontier and he brings his army in and they make him emperor. And it increasingly, the power of the Roman state declines dramatically. Now, these emperors, because they knew they had all of these unhappy people in Rome who don't have enough to eat, don't have opportunities, don't have jobs, they did two things. They created a welfare system, if you like, where they handed out food. And they also created the wonderful games that we associate with the Colosseum and the circus, games that would distract the people from their concerns. Now, given these problems for the average Roman, Christianity began to flourish. Christianity offered what people in this kind of psychological and economic circumstances needed. Both the peasants in the countryside and the mob in the city found in Christianity the security of a small group. Instead of the mass of humanity or being all alone by themselves, the church and the church congregation offered a small group security that people needed. It also offered the promise of a loving protector who was with them in good times, but was also with them in bad times, and who would assure them a degree of immortality simply by believing in that protector. So the ritualized worship of the early church gave people a consistency which their daily lives couldn't offer. And people flocked to that. They needed that kind of support, just as people need that same kind of support today. We don't like the unknown. And Christianity seemed to say, here's a future, here's an opportunity, come join us. So during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, we find Iranaeus in Lyon. Again, different name at the time, but the city of Lyon, France, which is, I think today, the second largest city in France. It was one of the biggest of the French cities in that day and age. And he was a priest. In 177, there was a heresy, Montanism, that had begun to show up in Lyon. And all of the priests, in order to fight this, got together and wrote a letter to the Pope. And they entrusted it to Iranaeus to take to Rome and make contact with the Pope and see what kind of assistance they could get in dealing with this heresy. It's one of these, you know, absence was a good thing, because it was while he was in Rome that Iranaeus missed a renewal of Christian persecution that broke out in Lyon. Several of the priests were eliminated as a part of that persecution. And when Iranaeus returns from his trip, he returns as the Bishop of Lyon. Again, his later years, he died about 202. So we're talking about the last quarter of a century of his life. Is relatively unknown. But what we do know is that he fought consistently against all forms of heresy, but especially Gnosticism, which was terribly attractive to an awful lot of early Christians, and it was a conscientious effort on the part of Iranaeus to eliminate that. He wrote fairly often, and his most famous work was called in English Against Heresies. Now, all of this was enough ultimately to get him canonized or given sainthood by the Catholic Church. With that background, Pastor Cyndi will then describe specific efforts against heresies that led to his being made a saint.